Northern Lights, a look at Minnesota books and writers, is presented by the Minnesota Center for the Book, a program of the Minnesota Humanities Commission, with funding provided by Target Stores and the Elmer L. and Eleanor J. Anderson Foundation.
Welcome to Northern Lights. I'm Ted Genoways, poet and editor at the Minnesota Historical Society Press. And it's my pleasure today to welcome Robert Bly, Minnesota poet and writer, for part two of a two-part interview with him. For this part, Robert, we're going to move back in time. We've covered your more recent work. This is our opportunity to start out at the beginning and hear how you got your start. First of all, tell us a little bit. You have that wonderful essay, being a Lutheran boy god in Minnesota, that's about your early years on the farm in Minnesota. Tell us a bit about your boyhood.
I suppose it wouldn't be unusual for the child or grandchild of any Lutheran, any Norwegian farmers. My family came in 1855 from a place called Bly in Norway, which still exists, and the relatives are there. As you know, in Norway, the oldest son gets the farm, period. The youngest son gets nothing. So the youngest son had nothing to do but to go on Garrison Keillor's show. That's one possibility. The other one was to go to the United States, where they'd get land free. So my relatives came to Lee, Illinois in 1855, and then around 1880 or 1885 they got in wagons and all came up to Minnesota, in the area around Madison, Minnesota, which was opening up at that time. So how strange that was, I went back in 1956, so there was 101 years with no connection. And Carol Bly and I met someone in a restaurant that day who knew Norway, and he said, "Can I go with you to see your relatives?" We said, "Oh, okay." So we went across the fjord, and he'd see people mowing in the pasture, and he'd come, "Hey, come up here, your relatives are here from America." And he'd say, "Are you related to Bly's?" "Oh, yes, my second cousin's sister was, and he did that about 5 times to show us that everyone in that valley was completely related. So it was very touching. There had been no connection for 101 years. I knocked at the door, and an old man who looked a lot like my father came to the door carrying a book of poetry. Poetry by Nordahl Grieg, who was a poet that they had during the war. He was killed over he was in the Air Force. So that was very sweet to come back to that, and I stayed in contact with them. And the strangest thing was that the little group there from around Bly had moved over to Minnesota in a group, so that all of the names of the farmers around me in childhood were the same names around the people in Bly. Unbelievable, isn't it? Unbelievable. So then my father was interested a lot in reading and so on, but his father died shortly before the Depression or in that time, and so he had to raise the whole family then. So he worked very hard. And there were 2 of us, my oldest brother who was really interested in farming and me who wasn't. And but my father, since he was interested in literature himself, never bugged me in the way that so many French fathers used to do with their sons, so that the sons hate the father for the rest of their lives. And so my father was a completely hard-working farmer who never went to college because he was called back because his own father died. And but I asked people about him, and they'd say things like, "Oh, your father, yes, he was the only man in the county who read books during the Depression." That's a fantastic remark about the amount of anxiety in the Depression was so deep that people really didn't read. And then when he retired, by the way, he started to read the like 35-volume History of the United States by Will Durant and his wife. And I was living about 3/4 of a mile away, and so I happened to be over there the day that he finished that last volume. And I said to him, well, Jacob, what did you learn? He said, nothing. Which was the other side, that arrogance. What did you learn? Nothing. Anyway, so that's the way that was. And then I had a school teacher in high school who, you probably saw her the other day. She was my poetry teacher in high school. And she's 83 now. And she came to that little party that they threw for me on the 75th birthday. And she was the star of the whole afternoon. And she said touching things like, that was the first job I ever had, was in Madison. And when I saw this young man come up to my desk, I said to myself, I'm going to have to work hard to keep ahead of this young man. And then she said, you know, I think the students were more serious then. And she talked about, well, what we all know now, the decline in seriousness in education, which is connected absolutely and entirely to the media. It's connected absolutely and entirely to capitalism wanting to pull people away from books and get them involved in buying stupid pop music and so on. It's been very successful. Because I was talking to some of my friends like that. I was in a generation with Robert Creeley and Donald Hall and all of those. And I said, you know, they said, why did you guys work so hard? Putting out magazines and doing all translating. I said, you know, at one point there was a feeling that America could become an intelligent nation. And some of the evidence for that was the way we drove 40 miles to see a French movie. The way we started to buy the translations of French work and German work that is being done by the New Directions Press. That's a sad sentence to me. It seemed at that time as if we could become an intelligent nation. So I tried to do my part, and others did too.
Tell me, in the essay I referred to, you quote at some length from a diary that you kept when you were young, and I have seen other essays where you refer to the diaries that you've kept. How long have you been keeping journals, and how faithful are you about that?
I kept very elaborate journals until about the middle of the 80s, and then I started to talk a lot. But I must have 40 or 45 or 50 of them. I haven't gone back to read them, but there's a lot in there that probably should be burned immediately. But that was called Being a Lutheran Boy God in Minnesota.
Right.
Why did I talk about a boy God? What was I talking about?
You were talking about, you mentioned being what you called the typical boy God, sort of having the sense of self and the sense of the possible. And
yeah. And there is a wonderful thing that Jung and others developed, and James Hillman really made wonderful things out of. The possibility that there are, both in boys and girls, there are some of them that are called puers or puellas, meaning that they are someone who has this instinct for ascension early on. And it's apparently genetic. It doesn't seem to run in the family exactly. And Peter Pan is a classic of one of those. And many pilots are like that. They don't want to land. They just want to keep flying all the time. And The Little Prince, remember that Exupery, The Little Prince? And so it has two things in it. It's a longing to go up into ascend, which can be an ascension into religion. I would obviously have been a monk, you know, if I'd been in the Middle Ages. There's no doubt about it. And you want to ascend, and there's something wonderful and positive about that. But at the same time, you're separated from the earth. And the young man in Exupéry's novel dies when a little snake comes out of the ground and bites him. So therefore there's this terrific fear of nature and life and women that goes along with this boy god, or flying boy. Flying boy is another way you can say it. So I was definitely a flying boy born on the farm.
When you went to the Navy, how did that change, or how was the Lutheran boy god received by the Navy?
Oh, these stories are ridiculous. I mean, it turns out I had a high mathematical aptitude, and they were trying to develop radar, so I was immediately put into a radar program in the Navy at Navy Pier. And that entire Navy Pier at that time was nothing but these young men in 3-layer bunks, you know, metal bunks, going half a mile. And I brought along my yellow pajamas. I'd be the only one. I'd stand up, and I'd be the only one in my yellow pajamas. Everyone else would have skivvies. Well, you understand. They always want to be special, this kind of a... Right. And then another thing that I would do, which was much more sensible, is that we had to walk about a quarter of a mile or half a mile to the end of Navy Pier to get our food. And so I would read Whitman. And people got used to me. I would walk down the center, and they'd get out of the way. You know, it's like, here's that guy, he's reading Whitman again. So it's hopeless, you know, but then it was actually a very good thing for me because I met someone in the Navy there, taking a class in radar, and there was a man named Isaac Eisenstein. And I saw him write a poem in front of me. And I guess I've said in print, I didn't know that human beings wrote poems. I thought that Englishmen wrote them. Or I don't know how they got into books, but there he was, just like me, in writing a poem. So we became deep friends. And we decided we were both too good for this program, and we tried to flunk out. And it didn't work. When we tried to flunk out, they'd pull out the IQ and they'd say things like, Mr. Bly, if you do not pass the test this Saturday, I can promise you that you will be on the next group of men landing on the next island in the Pacific. You'll be in front. I can promise you this. So what did you do? And I passed the test. Anyways, about the Navy. Very good for me, because in the end I caught rheumatic fever, and that was my way out. But then I got the GI Bill, and I was able to go to college. And so I went for 1 year to St. Olaf, and that was, I liked that. I liked it a lot, and it was okay. But my relative of mine was the dean, also from Bly, a Lutheran dean. Right. And I started to write a few little harmless things in the paper. And he called me in and he said, I know that you're a young intellectual, but I want to remind you that I am Dean Bly. I said, okay. So I went to the library, and I read about a place called Harvard, which people said was good. And I applied, and they took me. And so then I was able to, to pay for going to Harvard, which I'd never been able to do otherwise. And then at Harvard were all of those men and who had been in the Navy and Army for 2 or 3 years, and so they all came in one lump at Harvard at that time. And it was an unbelievable class of about 22 writers, all of them fierce characters. And wow, and I think 21 of them all became permanent writers, you know.
I was just going to say, this workshop.
Frank, Freddie Gwynn, the Munster, he didn't become a writer, but he became very well known. And George Plimpton was one of those, and Donald Hall was one of those, and Adrian Rich was also connected with our group. And John Hawkes was one of them, and Crichton, Michael Crichton's father, and so on. It was just incredible. Everybody worked really hard. And we were difficult to deal with because Archibald MacLeish was our first teacher.
Right.
And he was used to people being very polite to him at the Library of Congress. And so I remember about the second class we had, Archibald MacLeish came in and said, I have a friend, his name is Ezra Pound, and I know him, and I'm going to read you a poem of his. And one of the veterans said, you have any friends that write better poems? So that was really very wonderful. So at the end of that time, and I'm just reading a biography of Robert Creeley. And Robert Creeley was born exactly the same time I was, and he was in the medical unit in the Second World War. And he was at Harvard at the same time I was, though I didn't meet him, strangely enough. And he himself finally flunked out of Harvard or left. I think he told me one time he got drunk and went swimming down the Charles, and they picked him up 3 or 4 miles down the river. And they said, what are you doing? He said, I plan to swim to the other shore, you know. Anyway, but it was strange because as soon as he got free, he too went, and he ended up in Mallorca and so on, putting out magazines, trying to do translations, trying to bring in German poetry and French poetry to the people my age and a little younger and older. And that's what I did too. I mean, I was in New York 3 years or so after I graduated, and then when I went to Minnesota and lived on a farm which my father had saved for me, I didn't get any money out of it, but I didn't have to pay rent. And if I give reading in a college, I say to the students, you know, if you're going to write poetry, having a place where you don't have to pay rent is very important, very important thing. So then James Wright turned up at the University of Minnesota, and Bill Duffy, who is still around here, he and I started the 50s, and we're still doing that sort of thing. And there was that wonderful excitement about culture, which is exactly like driving 45 miles to see a French movie. By the way, Michael Ventura is a wonderful writer. I don't know if you know him. He lives in L.A., and he has a column once a week. And I read something of his a couple of weeks ago, and this is what he said. He was brought up in an orphanage in upstate New York. But when he came out of that, they would drive 50, 60 miles to see a French movie. One of those black and white things. And when they'd come home, they'd talk excitedly all the way home. Now, he said, the funniest thing is that now you can go and pick those movies up at the video store, and no one really sees them or talks about them anymore. He said it's possible that the difficulty it takes you to arrive at a place where there's a work of art is connected to how well you absorb it. And that's amazing. So having ballet on TV is nothing. It's nothing. And I personally think that what should be done with Rembrandt is that every painting of his should be put into a separate cabin in Colorado. And you have to walk 30 miles to get to see it. Then you're allowed to stay inside the cabin for 30 minutes, and you have to leave and go back to New York. But I really feel that there's something about that that's really true, and that's the joy of translating. I've done so much. Part of the joy of translating is like walking 30 miles to get the poem. Instead of reading someone else's translation, you know it, you translate marvelously Miguel Hernandez. And you have to go to the dictionary and find all these words. It's like walking. And finally you get them all together and you say, wow, what a poem! Unbelievable. I never thought he would get from the 6th line to the 7th line that way. Isn't that right?
Yes, definitely.
That wonderful surprise. So you and I are a lot alike, actually. Well, we drive a long way to get a Spanish movie.
Well, it's interesting that you bring up this sense of the difficulty of getting to a place, and also the isolation of the place, because that's sort of at least I have the sense of that's part of what you were doing in coming back to Minnesota and in living on the farm, that there those poems, especially in the first book, which
Silence in the
Silence
Snowy
in the
Fields.
Snowy Fields.
You see, I know what you're saying, and there was a wonderful isolation there, and you're out of all of that arguments about who's best and who isn't in New York. But also, I tried to write elaborate poems in college, but I really didn't understand the words in some way. When I moved back to the farm, I understood that I know the meaning of certain words. Snow is one. Dust, cornfield, box elder trees. They only are in western Minnesota. No one knows what they are. But to write poems using words that you actually know. So I'll read you one of these poems, shall I?
Please.
Oh, in an early morning I think I shall live forever. I am wrapped in my joyful flesh as the grass is wrapped in its clouds of green. That's the first stanza. Rising from a bed where I dreamt of long rides past castles and hot coals, the sun lies happily on my knees. I was sitting in the door of my chicken house. The sun lies happily on my knees. I have suffered and survived the night, bathed in dark water, like any blade of grass. Third stanza. The strong leaves of the box elder trees, plunging in the wind, call us to disappear into the wilds of the universe. There's that God boy coming up again, right? The strong leaves of the box elder trees. See, that means more to me than the strong leaves of the oak trees or the strong leaves of the cedar trees. What do I know about them? The strong leaves of the box elder trees, plunging in the wind, call us to disappear into the wilds of the universe, where we shall sit at the foot of a plant and live forever like the dust. Can you feel myself settling down and feeling it's all right not to be near a huge cathedral, but to just sit next to a corn plant and live forever, not like the angels do, but like the dust does. Right. Anyway, so I'm still fond of this book, Silence in the Snowy Fields, because it, you know.
What I find fascinating is how closely there are those poems which are so rooted in place, and so though they're not confessional, as you've often said, that they're personal poems, and there's a personal landscape that's created there. Mm-hmm. And then in the next book, in The Light Around the Body, it's these poems that reach halfway around the world and deal with very public matters, and were poems of Vietnam and of your opposition to the war in Vietnam.
I know that is a big shock to me too, but I would say two things. First of all, the poems have to come out of what you really know, and it's like you feel it around you. I felt around me the farmers doing their work and the bugs and all those things. Then I'm in the center of that. But around 1958 to 1960 and so on, 65, we became aware of being in the center of something else, which was kind of a vast selfishness of the American culture, of the American political system, and the whole business of pushing nuclear power on people without telling them it was going to harm them, etc. All of that is something that we can feel it now. With the Bush too, you can feel it with the country moving toward that selfishness, wanting to drill in Alaska. We don't care what happens to anybody, and basically Bush said, you only love me when I'm in war. So I got news for you. We're going to have war for the next 3 years. And we felt that too. That once the Vietnam War started, people said, "This is what we're going to have. We're going to have this. You live with it. You swallow it." So that many other writers besides me, many writers said, we're not going to swallow that. Because if you don't say anything in the midst of this, you become absorbed by it. We weren't trying to change the whole world. We're trying to save our own lives so we didn't get sucked into this. I didn't feel that that doing political work is that much different from writing poems about nature. In either case, you're surrounded by something, and the question is, are you going to take part in it, or are you just going to go to sleep? So I feel that a time is coming again now in which we have to begin speaking out in the political way. Do you think so?
I agree, and I was just going to ask you, I mean, how do you feel, or what is the state of political poetry, or whatever label you might want to put on it, the poetry of social conscience right now in this country?
Well, I don't think there is much right now. You know, some of the old guys, like Ferlinghetti, are still alive, and I really respect the way they continue to do that. You know, Ferlinghetti really believed all of that, and he still does, that there's a nation here of ordinary people that are very valuable. One of the touching things about him is that he started the City Lights bookstore, which is just like a place to go and buy French movies, right? And people in the 60s, you know, were told that stealing was a groovy thing, and they were stealing a lot of books from him. They stole about $10,000 a year, and he wouldn't put in a policeman, because that's more like what the politician would do. He went out and gave poetry readings and earned the $10,000 and put that in. Now that's beautiful. That's beautiful.
Do you consider any of your own recent work to be political in any way, or?
Well, you know, political also means that you sense what people don't want you to say, and then you say it.
Right.
So I wanted to say in Iron John that men are very honorable in many ways, and I like them tremendously. And they're not all criminals, et cetera, et cetera. Well, a lot of people were furious about that and attacked me a lot. And then I did the Sibling Society, in which I'm saying this country is getting more and more childish all the time. It's hard to find a grown-up anymore. And of course, again, that has to do with capitalism wanting to appeal to the childish side of you, the one that always buys candy and buys another VCR. And so we're allowing the material around consumerism to block the growth of our children into adults. That's unbelievable. I mean, anything human beings have always wanted was to admire the older people and become a concerned and thoughtful older person. And this is the first nation that we really know of. You can feel it in France right away. You go down the street and you see all these sad faces. Well, a grown-up is sad because the world is sad. Then you see this idiotic American smiling, you know, like Seinfeld, and you say, whoa, where'd he come from?
Well, Robert, there's so much more to talk about, but I'm afraid that's all the time that we have. But we'll have to do another one of these at least.
Thank you, Ted. I enjoyed being with you very much.
And thank you for joining us. This has been Northern Lights.
I put a lot of stock in fishermen along rivers, and old people, and those who appear after a long illness. They have something in their eyes that you don't see much anymore. The old.
Northern Lights, a look at Minnesota books and writers, is presented by the Minnesota Center for the Book, a program of the Minnesota Humanities Commission, with funding provided by Target Stores and the Elmer L. and Eleanor J. Anderson Foundation.